The Clash of Kings, Stamford Bridge and the End of the Vikings, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, September 25th, 1066, the final clash of the Vikings, the year 1066, a year destined to echo through the annals of history, a year that would mark the twilight of one of the greatest eras of raiding, conquest, and exploration the world had ever known. It was the year that the Viking Age in England would come to a violent, thunderous end. On September 25th, 1066, the winds of fate would blow across the lush, rolling plains of Yorkshire. The air was thick with the stench of impending war, as two mighty forces prepared to meet on the bloodied fields of Stamford Bridge. One side was led by a king who had risen from humble origins, fighting for his people and his throne. The other, the Vikings, the men who had once terrorized Europe's coastlines, fought not just for gold, but for the very right to claim a kingdom. This was the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a Viking dream of conquest. For years, the Norsemen had cast their shadow over England, their longships cutting through the waters like dark, malevolent serpents. In 1066, the Vikings came not as plunderers but conquerors. King Harald Hardrada of Norway, known as the last of the Viking kings, sought to fulfill an ancient claim to the English throne. His invasion was bolstered by his brother-in-law, Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of King Harald II of England, who hoped to reclaim his birthright. The battle they sought was not just one of land, but of legend. Hardrada, with a fleet of over 300 ships and an army of seasoned warriors, landed in York in late August, quickly overpowering local English resistance. The Viking king was confident. His army was strong, seasoned, and ready for a decisive campaign. They had tasted victory in York, and the winds seemed to be blowing in their favor. But the storm brewing to the south would change everything. A king's vengeance, Harald Godwinson sat on the throne of England, a warrior king hardened by years of battles and political strife. Harald had been crowned king only months before, after the death of Edward the Confessor. With enemies on all sides, Normans from the south and now Vikings in the north, he was a man under siege. Yet the threat of the Norsemen was more than just a foreign army. It was a defiance of the Anglo-Saxon kingship itself. Harold's response was swift. Upon hearing of Hardrada's invasion, he broke camp in the south, where he had been facing the threat of the Normans, and raced north with his army, a feat that would test the mettle of even the most seasoned warriors. The march was grueling, and Harold's men were weary from months of military campaigns. Yet, the prospect of defending their homeland against the very Viking invaders who had once ravaged their shores gave them the fire to continue. Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge after an exhausting 180-mile march. The Vikings, believing themselves safe and unchallenged, were caught entirely by surprise. Most of them were unprepared for battle, their armor left behind as they relaxed in their camp. The element of surprise had now shifted to the English. The clash of steel and blood. The battle that unfolded was one of chaos and fury. The Vikings, still recovering from their recent victories, were unready to face a determined, battle-hardened English army. The fighting was savage, a true clash of iron and blood, each side battling not just for land but for survival. The most legendary moment of Stamford Bridge was the defense of a single bridge over the river Derwent. As the English advanced, a lone Viking warrior, a giant armed with an enormous axe, stood alone on the narrow bridge, fending off wave after wave of attackers. His legend would be sealed in the annals of history as the embodiment of Viking courage, his axe swinging like a force of nature. But even the greatest warriors fall, and after a fierce struggle, the bridge defender was slain. The way forward for the English was now open. Yet the Vikings were not easily defeated. They fought with the ferocity of men who knew this battle could mean their last. Their shield walls held, their axes and swords flashing in the sunlight. But it was clear. The tide was turning. King Harald Hardrada, the mightiest Viking king in Europe, fell on the battlefield, struck down by an arrow to the throat. With him died the hopes of a Viking kingdom in England, a kingdom shattered. By the end of the day, the field was littered with the bodies of the fallen. The English had won, but at a heavy cost. The battle had been brutal, and the victors were exhausted and bloodied. Hardrada's army had been crushed, but Harald Godwinson's men had paid a high price for their victory. The Norse invaders were decimated, and Tostig Godwinson, Harald's brother, was slain alongside his Viking allies. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a decisive victory for the Anglo-Saxons, but it came too late. The shock and exhaustion of the battle left Harold's forces weakened, and only days after the bloody conflict, word arrived of the Norman invasion. William the Conqueror had landed on the southern shores, and the fate of England now hung in the balance. The end of the Viking Age. Stamford Bridge was the last great Viking assault on England. The shock of the battle reverberated through the Viking world, signaling the end of an era. The shield walls, once the symbol of Norse power, were now broken, and the age of the Viking invader was over. But the winds of fate would soon turn again. Harold's victory, hard-won and fleeting, was overshadowed by the impending Norman onslaught. The year 1066 was far from over, and England's fate was still uncertain. As the sun set on the battlefield at Stamford Bridge, the final echoes of Viking battle cries faded into history. But the stories of those who fought and died that day, their bravery, their strength, and their sacrifice, would endure forever. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was not just a fight for a kingdom, it was the final chapter in the saga of the Vikings, a violent and glorious end to their age-long conquest of England. And though the Vikings were no more, their legend would live on forever, in the blood of England's warriors and in the pages of history.